Those three women, Mary Magdalene, and Salome, went to the tomb early in the morning, but they had no expectations of resurrection. They were there for another purpose. They were there to honor the memory as well as the body of their deceased Lord. Nonetheless, in the early hours of that blessed morning, they became the first witnesses of resurrection power. I say witnesses, and yet this is really a story about what they did not see rather than what they did see. Expecting a heavy stone in their way, instead they found that the stone was removed, and where they expected to find the body of Jesus, a messenger gave the news of a great absence. He is not here, in this tomb, that is. In other words, if you're looking for Jesus, you will not find him in the place where death gets the last word. And as good as that news was, Mark's gospel ends with three women running up the aisle in terror and amazement, even with fear. Now, that's quite an abrupt ending to a gospel, a book that's supposed to be about good news. If you look in the footnotes of the Bible in the pew back in front of you or in another Bible, you'll notice that people have been trying to smooth out this abrupt ending to Mark's gospel. They've done it in some different ways, and yet it's most likely that this very stark ending, the one that doesn't resolve, is probably the original ending. How human and how natural for these three women to hear such unexpected news and to respond with amazement indeed, but terror doesn't seem out of line either. How does one make sense of that which is beyond all comprehension? The news that gathers us here still 2,000 years later is so far beyond the normal occurrence of things that we would only be fooling ourselves to try to make sense of it. But where answers or explanations are beyond the grasp of the mind, the messenger in that tomb gave the women instructions that the feet could follow. Go. Gather up the disciples and make your way back to Galilee. And when you get there, the living Jesus will meet you there. Making sense of it wasn't an option, but go to Galilee was a clear and tangible directive that the women could handle, could follow. But that guidance, go back to Galilee, is an instruction for us still today, too. For the reader, including us, to go back to Galilee calls our attention back to the ministry of the one who came from Nazareth of Galilee. Going back to Galilee, then, is a reminder to keep in our hearts and our minds the things that Jesus did throughout his ministry. To go back to Galilee reminds us of the way that Jesus burst onto the scene, proclaiming God's kingdom, a new way of being in the world. In fact, a whole new kind of world where God's loving will prevails. To go back to Galilee is to remember that Jesus never took the easy way out, even when the temptation was strong. To go back to Galilee is to remember what those first disciples saw in him as they dropped everything so that they might follow him. To go back to Galilee is to remember the profound love that was shown when Jesus saw someone suffering or afflicted by oppression, and when he saw children and when he encountered others who had been called outsider. To go back to Galilee is to remember the ministry of the one who kept healing individuals. And yet every time an individual, a person, was made whole, it seemed like the whole community they were part of was put back together too. And to go back to Galilee is to remember that he kept resisting worldly ways of power, and at each turn his ways proved more powerful indeed. And to go back to Galilee is to remember the stories that he told, the parables, and the ways that they kept drawing us and calling us to find God's kingdom in our midst. And yet at the same time, they left us longing for more and more and more. To go back to Galilee is to remember the way that Jesus taught the crowds into the late afternoon when they found themselves hungry, and then through his own example of generosity and sharing, he made sure that everyone had enough so that they could see the world was an abundant place. To go back to Galilee is to remember that all of it that he did, all of it, was a sign of a beautiful life and the way that Jesus made others' lives beautiful too. But when we go back and consider what he did in Galilee, we must remember that all that goodness, his life and ministry, was a sign pointing us to this: unending life, resurrection life. The goodness of his life-giving power was always intended to expand and continue, unending. In Jesus, we find life giving way to more life, unending life. He is not here, the messenger in that tomb told the women. No, he is not bound by death, but he is to be found in the places where life keeps unfolding. To go back to Galilee is to meet Jesus there and to remember the kind of life that he lived, proclaimed, and still offers to us. Abundant life is what he called it in another gospel. We do well, this many years later, to keep going back to Galilee and to remember. But that instruction to go back to Galilee meant something more than just a call to remember what Jesus did. And the messenger told the women to gather up the other disciples and to make their way back to Galilee, he was telling them to return home. And the resurrected Jesus will meet you when you get there. To go back to Galilee is still a call for us to look for Jesus' life-giving power in the places where we spend our lives. Go back to Galilee is a call to follow him where you live, to notice the places of life unfolding around you, and to be a witness to his kind of life in the places you find yourselves. The news of that empty tomb still calls us to go back to our homes, be healers to the ones who hurt, to show compassion when we see those who are suffering, to generously welcome people into our places of community, to remove isolation and honor and dignify those who are deemed other. To put it simply, to love deeply. When we do all that, we are witnesses to the one whose life conquers death. Like the women, As they left that empty tomb, we may still find plenty of reasons to live in terror and amazement. And if you hang out here enough, you know that I dwell on those things. But not today, friends. Because like them, we are still wise to keep gathering up with one another, remembering the work of Jesus, and abiding in hope in the places where we spend our days, knowing that this is the place where Jesus will still meet us. We recognize his presence when we notice life expanding, communities' roots growing deeper, oppressive chains falling off, and goodness overcoming finality. I cannot begin to explain to you what happened in that tomb. And it makes sense that the first witnesses were confounded, even scared by the news. And while they were also amazed. But I do know, and what I cannot explain, that when we still remember and live like Jesus, we too are witnesses to the power of God, the power of life over death. He is not here, the messenger said, and we're still not going to find him if we go looking for him in the places of death. The good news of Easter, the good news that gathers us in this time and in this space, is that life, God's unfolding life, gets the final word. Friends, with joy and with boldness, we can proclaim, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Thanks be to God. Amen.